All right, let's get underway. Um, Hello, everyone, uh, and welcome to this Conservation Council of the ACT webinar. It's our first for the year, first of many, I hope. My name is Jonathan Curtis, and today we're looking at sweltering cities, and the webinar is coming to you from Ngunnawal country. With Canberra forecast to hit, I think it's 42 or 43 degrees today. And I can't remember when it's been that hot in Canberra. I'm sure it has been, but
It
it's
has.
the hottest it's been in a while, I think. It seems the perfect time for a conversation about the increasing risk that climate change will cause extreme and even lethal heat in cities. So I'm delighted to welcome Emma Bacon, who's the Executive Director and founder of the Sweltering Cities organisation. If you haven't heard of Sweltering Cities, the name kind of says it all, I think. It's Australia's only national advocacy organisation working specifically on issues related to extreme heat and advocating for better climate safe cities. Emma's a veteran campaign coordinator and project manager, and she's worked with the New South Wales Greens, the Boomerang Alliance, and Ban Asbestos campaign coordinator for Union Aid Abroad. Emma, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank
Uh,
you for having me.
I've got lots of questions for Emma, but we'll move to audience questions probably about halfway through. So as we're going, please just drop any questions you have into the chat, and we'll put them to Emma as we go through. So, um, Emma, let's get into it. Welcome again. Let's start with a bit of a backstory. Tell me about you and Sweltering Cities. Um, you
Thanks very
founded
much.
it.
Yes, I did. I did. It is the best and hardest thing I've ever done.
I did.
Um,
Have a look at him.
so I founded Sweltering Cities alongside some other amazing like early board members and supporters at the beginning of 2020. But the story actually starts, I think, a couple of years before that, when we had started having some really like I had started having some really powerful conversations with people who were friends of friends or family and others who lived in Western Sydney, which is an extremely hot region, and people saying they were just dreading the summer. And I've been working in sort of climate change and environment adjacent work for a while, and I was hearing these intense stories. I have this really distinct memory of talking to someone who was saying, um, their house gets so hot, they have aircon, but they can't afford to run it. So someone who lives near Blacktown and Penrith. And so what they did, they and their daughter, they wait till they got sick in the heat, and then when they felt really ill, they would go and sit in their car for a couple of hours with the aircon on to wait till they feel better. And that felt like the best option for them. And it was stories like that, and hearing them from across Western Sydney, but also other places, and just going to people and saying, like, someone should be campaigning about this, someone should be talking about this. My background, as you mentioned, is partly in like political campaigning and organizing, but I've also been a union organizer with shopping center cleaners, with bank workers. And so, really embedded in like the values of sweltering cities is the idea of collectivizing this problem. So people feel heat often as an individual problem. We feel like, if my house is too hot, if I have a landlord that won't, give me better blinds, if I can't afford to turn on aircon, anything like that, then that's on me to solve. And the best solution is to try and find somewhere cool or put a wet towel on the back of your neck, or things like that. But actually, when we're talking about extreme heat, this is something that, thousands, tens of thousands, this week, millions of people are experiencing, and they're experiencing in lots of common ways, driven by often inequality. And so, if we treat heat as an individual problem, then the solutions are individual. It's like you have to keep cool. But if we understand it as a collective problem, if we understand rising temperatures as a collective problem, then the solutions have to be transformative, they have to be urgent, and they have to be really ambitious. And then we look at the scale of climate action, fixing our housing system, better transport, things like that. So, that's really, I think, the ways that my values and my background has sort of informed the way that we work. And yeah, we started just before weeks before COVID, and I think the fact that we've managed to grow a community-facing organization in that time just shows like the incredible energy people have for these conversations in their communities.
Yeah, it's very much as a society, the pointy end of climate change, isn't it? Because cities are where most Australians live, and it's the effect that is going to most impact on them. Let's talk a bit about the effects of heat emergencies. The obvious one is a health one. Um, what do we know about the health effects? Because it can actually it can be lethal, can't it? It's not merely a bit uncomfortable. I saw your post on LinkedIn, I think it was, about media still portraying hot days, really basically a day when you go to the beach and cool off, very Australian thing. It's not just about being hot and uncomfortable.
Mm. Yeah, it's something that we are really trying to shift. And now that people are listening to me now, I'm sure you're going to start seeing all the coverage of the heat. But often when you've got news articles like potentially saying like record heat, like hottest day ever, this is really dangerous. The text is laying out like heat waves are the biggest killer, but the photo will be of people at the beach. And it is like almost quite remarkable at this point. Like we were looking at some ABC Instagram posts from a few weeks ago and it was posts about health advice, and the advice is really good. Stay hydrated, stay cool, stay inside, reduce physical activity in the heat. But the photos they used to illustrate it were people playing football at the beach. And it was like there's just a real disconnect between, our I think historical understanding of what summers were, maybe in our childhoods in the past, that isn't reflective of actually the danger and the risk and the extreme temperatures people are feeling now. And like when I think that the three sort of biggest categories like of impacts we see are like the physical health risks. So that's like, there's direct heat related illness like dehydration, heat exhaustion, heat stroke. Heat stroke, the really most severe, has an 80% fatality rate. So if you let your body, not you let, if your body gets that hot, and you start to see those symptoms, like that's a real case, like it's a medical emergency. But also it's about exacerbating the underlying conditions, whether it's chronic illness, whether it's disabilities, like health issues remade that. So like, often we see heat illness is actually like it's not counted as accurately as it should be because people might end up in hospital or the doctor because of respiratory illness, because of gastrointestinal, because of cardiovascular impacts. They're actually driven by heat, but they're recorded as being related to those issues. The second big pool of impacts is the mental health impacts. So you've got, we hear from people, like thousands of people across the country, that they are anxious, they are dreading the summer, they are depressed because they are, trying to stay inside on hot days, and they are just trying to calculate, like, can I afford to turn the aircon on? Or can I afford to like go out and see my friends, buy fresh fruit and vegetables? And that mental pressure is huge alongside the sleeplessness. Like if you're in a hot house, for the next few days, it's going to be really hot in Canberra. And it's like, and lots of places. Like the other day in Adelaide, they had their hottest night ever. It didn't get below 34 degrees a few nights ago in Adelaide. And if you think about what it's like to not be able to sleep for days at a time and the mental pressure that puts on people is huge. And we've got research demonstrating this. Like, really tragically, we know that youth suicidality goes up in the heat. So, for every temperature above sort of 24, 20, every degree above 24, 25, you see an increase in young people ending up in hospital or dying from suicide. And, that's again, it's a horrible thing to know, but these are the impacts of heat. And I think finally, the thing to say is like, we know that there's social impacts of heat as well. So, what does that stress do more broadly to us? We know that it leads to like an increase in family and domestic violence. There's evidence overseas of it causing like an increase in hate speech, in stress. These are things you can say in like a public health report, but I think also something that lots of us can sense. If it's been really hot for a week, the people in our communities might feel like they're more on edge. You might see more conflict and things like that. So, the image that you get of like people at the beach or people in the water or people in the pool just like really is at odds with actually what we know those impacts are. And tragically, heat waves are the biggest killer of any environmental disaster. So we know that people will have died this week, but we just don't know their names in the same way as we do for other disasters.
Noting the limitation around that reporting, what do we know about heat-related deaths in Australia, even with those limitations? I watched a fairly horrifying documentary of one of the heat emergencies in Paris, which that they particularly retrospective studies on mortality, unexpected mortality, I think is some term like that. Over 20,000 people died, if I recall, in that heat wave. What do we know in Australia? Have we had any heat emergencies?
We have had heat emergencies. I think the scale of what's happened in Europe is quite mind-blowing. I think it was the
Mm,
2023 their summer, I believe, it's 2023, 2024, where they had a really severe heat event for months, and they put the deaths across the summer at 60,000 across Europe. Including
yeah,
it was I think 6,000 in a week in Spain. So like this is a combination of, in Australia, something like 75% of households have air conditioning. In France, it's like 10 to 15%. Like it's hardly anyone. And so it is that like, the unusual heat means that people who are not prepared or used to it and they don't have behavioral responses to it are really struggling. Also, like people are insecure workers, there's not enough protections, things like that. So the numbers in other parts of the world are really stark. Something that people often reference is that the Black Saturday fires in Victoria, I think 178 people died related to the fires, but double that died because of the heat. Like, I think you mentioned a lot of the information we have is retrospective because we're not counting people in real time, but also because, we're not counting people in real time, but also we're not necessarily counting like the ongoing, like the long tail of impacts. Like if you
yeah.
have a really hot week this week and you're really stressed, your body's stressed, you're feeling dehydrated, you're not sleeping, it's exacerbating existing conditions, and then end up in hospital next week, it's not effectively being counted, even I think in like good practice. But things we do know is that you are more likely to end up in hospital or die if you are poor. You're more likely, 89%, the studies have shown that 89% of people in Australia who die during heat waves are people with disabilities, which is a really horrible statistic. And we know that the National Climate Risk Assessment and other studies say that, deaths and illness are just going to dramatically increase over time.
There's some really interesting comments coming through in chat. Thanks um, to everyone for putting those in. Um, there's going beyond the health. I think it's worth also touching on some of those broader effects. Um, Extreme heat seems to have some fairly um, adverse effects on infrastructure as well, doesn't it? Sort of the transport, energy, communications infrastructure, a whole lot of other of society's core functions can start unraveling a bit in extreme heat. Can
Mhm.
you comment on that?
Yeah, I think we don't have to think very far back to see how some of our infrastructure doesn't work very well in the heat because it was the first week of January of this year when some of the trains stopped working because of the heat. I know we heard a story from someone who was on the Sydney to Melbourne train, and it got turned back in the middle of the night because the tracks weren't safe to use in the heat. And then there were the fires later in the week. And so, like, our existing infrastructure just isn't safe. Like, you hear that about trams, trains, um, all sorts of things. There's the physical element of like the way we plan and build isn't necessarily climate safe. Like this comes up with soft fall in playgrounds. People might see that's sometimes made of like old recycled tires that have been processed and then have a chemical layer. And that can get to, 80 to 90 degrees in the heat. It gets much hotter than concrete, much hotter, even the metal can get, and that can burn people. And that's because these materials have not been tested in the climate that we like either currently experiencing or are going to see into the future. And so we need to make sure that like, climate resilience is saying like, or how is our infrastructure being tested? I think one of the really big things we see is that our workplace laws are not really fit for purpose for the heat. And so, very few people have in their workplaces have adequate heat plans, especially people who might be like bus drivers or, help repair things or deliver food and things like that. So one of the things is because heat is both like has a physical impact on things, though if you can imagine a street near you that doesn't have anyone on it, on a 25-degree day and a 40-degree day, there isn't necessarily going to be like a lot of visual difference in that, but it will be unsafe potentially for people to be on the street on a 40-degree day. And so because you've got that health impacts and because we don't have like good workplace protections for people, I think that's like it's not just the physical infrastructure, it's the social infrastructure that's also vulnerable as well. I think that's something important to keep in mind.
And possibly of most concern to some governments and businesses, it impacts productivity, doesn't it?
Huge, huge impacts. Potentially billions, if not trillions of dollars of impacts on productivity. We've been trying to understand, I think, from the Sweltering Cities perspective, a bit more of what it means. Like it's often calculated in like lost hours or lost days to the heat. And we were asking a question a few months ago of like, well, who is losing this time? Like, is it companies that, contracts are going out, they can't work, but they're still paying for people? Is it people who are working less? And I think the answer we've got from international experts is to say this is often calculated on like temperatures at which it's not safe to work anymore. And then there's a whole range of ways those hours and that time is lost. So, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen, the last few weeks, especially in Victoria, where it's been hitting those like 40 degrees, 45 degrees yesterday, businesses closing. And if you're a small business that's losing sort of days of time, if your staff is losing days of time, like that's having that impact. But also, like, you know, the easiest industries that people can analyze this in, well, maybe not the easiest, but like the industries that have been most clearly analyzed for this, manufacturing, agriculture, and construction. And so we know all of those people are like highly vulnerable to heat, and there's just going to be, places where people won't be able to work during the day um, in summer, and like that will of course have like flow-on economic effects. And what I think we really want to understand is like it's a big number to say like hundreds of billions of dollars will be lost, but like who is losing that
Yeah.
is really important, I think, to understand because that is also a driver of like inequality, but also like small business impacts as well.
Yeah. What one of the terms that keeps it always comes up in relation to extreme and growing extremes of heat in cities is the heat island effect. I think most people have an intuitive sense of what that is, but do you want to just
Yeah,
give us a snapshot of the heat island effect, how it
sure.
works, and what's and how it's changing?
Mm,
So I imagine that one of the interesting kind of perverse outcomes of densification, for example, and we in Canberra we've been looking at this in relation to the missing middle changes to urban planning laws to allow greater density for all sorts of good reasons. But we also need to be careful of the effects that that can have.
yeah. Um, like our, perspective as an organization is that with greater density should come better design.
Yeah,
And like unfortunately what we're seeing in some places, like definitely in Sydney and Melbourne, and I'm not as familiar with the ACT planning code, but definitely in Sydney and Melbourne, is that the provisions for more density, sometimes what you lose out is like landscaping. So like they reduce the provisions for landscaping on the block, which means that you have like a lot of houses, no street cooling, no, and it's like, well, this is it's more housing, but it's not housing that's fit for the future. And actually, we are totally capable of designing, more dense, beautiful, greener housing with more infrastructure. I think, it's about who is paying the costs of that. And it's like cheaply built housing is not affordable living because, like, the people who live there will pay in their electricity bills and their health costs, and will all pay when it comes to the climate. Um, so in terms of the urban heat, that's my small rant about density, and the need to have beautiful design. So urban heat island effect, is where you have like the way, like the physical characteristics of a space can increase the temperatures as compared to coastal or rural areas. So if you have lots of dark surfaces, it attracts the sun, increases the heat. If you have concrete, then it absorbs the temperatures, can create a big thermal mass. It also radiates it out at night, so increasing nighttime temperatures. If you don't have very many trees, then it's, no shade on those surfaces, but also you don't have that evaporative cooling effect that trees and shade or trees can give, but also shade can give. And so, what that means is that these areas can be 5, 10, even 15 degrees hotter than the surrounding like rural or like coastal areas or even some parks. I think the example I always give to people is the difference between, what's it like to stand under a tree in a park on a hot day as opposed to what's it like to walk across an unsheltered shopping center car park on a hot day. And I think that that is the sort of contrast that you get. But urban heat islands can happen at lots of different scales and like you can feel it in lots of different ways. So like lots of traffic intersections are really small urban heat islands because you have a lot of asphalt and no shade and things like that. So if you have really wide roads and lots of dark surfaces, it will feel physically hotter as a pedestrian in those spaces. And then you get islands which are more like suburban scale, and we've got urban heat island or urban heat continents, which is where you've got enough islands together that the space is big enough so that the experts have named it a bigger thing because of how dramatic that problem is.
That must apply very significantly in areas like I know you're in
Mm.
Melbourne at the moment, the western that vast sort of archipelago of suburbs that stretches out, and the same for Sydney and probably most other cities. Is that the kind of
Yeah.
thing you're referring to?
Yeah, and I think there's maybe this like really conventional view. It's like, oh, Western Sydney, lots of houses close together, dark roofs, things like that. And there 100% are parts of Western Sydney like that. That's really true. Though I think in ways because Western Sydney has like felt the really severe impacts of heat, there is a lot more government work to fix the problem with Western Sydney. You don't get the same attention other places, but in fact, you can get like an aerial photo of any of the capital cities and most of our regional cities, and like a cookie cutter. You can do an aerial shot, and it's pretty cookie cutter, like small blocks, um, dark roofs, not a lot of trees. And like this is something we hear from like people in Wagga Wagga, people in Ballarat, people like in lots of different countries. They're saying like, you can go to the new suburbs in lots of places. They look exactly the same. Like they're being bought for like this. It's the same developers making the same types of housing. And so I think that it's even though in the sort of I think conventional wisdom as you think about this the biggest cities and the biggest suburbs, actually this type of urban heat island planning is much more pervasive than people maybe think as well.
How how good is the data around this in terms of knowing the specifics of it? And those in the audience, I'd be really interested in your comments on how good our data is uh, in a geospatial sense for the ACT. Because I won't put Emma on the spot and say, what about the ACT?
Yeah, the
What does
ACT.
ours look like?
Um,
But probably some of those of you in the audience will have a very good view sense of that. But sorry, Emma, go ahead.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, in general, we have a really great sense of where things are, and like,
Mm.
that um the differences are more in like how frequently the data is updated and exactly what it measures. But we have urban heat island data for everywhere, every urban area in Australia. It just depends on like how granular it is, and like then you've got different governments. Like the New South Wales government has done the heat vulnerability index study, which shows like all the different areas in their heat vulnerability, which is a combination of like the demographic details alongside the physical characteristics and sort of income and health and things like that. But like, it's a bit of a frustration on our end because, we're often pitched. I think sometimes it's like companies who essentially scrape government data and then want to sell it back to local government as a product. And they come to us and they say, oh, we're going to map where it's hot. And I'm like, I can draw you a map of where it's hot. Like, most people can tell you where in their city and their suburb is hot. In a lot of ways, local government are really doing the heavy lifting on this. So if people are really interested, and I know there's a different system in the ACT, but like your closest level of government will have the most information for you on urban heat islands and things like that.
Andrew, thank you. I see you've just posted a Environment ACT CSIRO mapping surface urban heat in Canberra. That's great. Let's move on to then, having admired the problem, what do we do about it? I mean, there's some obvious stuff. You've talked about design. Uh, it would seem the answer would seem to, apart from doing something about climate change, uh, the design would seem to require a systemic approach that tackles individual buildings, streets, urban design, a pretty multifaceted sort of approach.
Yeah, it does require, yeah, I think a really systems view of all the different impacts at different scales. Of course, it is extremely, from our perspective, it's extremely frustrating to be seeing these record temperatures, understanding so deeply the impacts. We're living in this world this week where it's like, okay, it was 45 degrees for one day yesterday in Melbourne, but what if that was a 4 day event? Like it's going to be, in the 30s this week in Canberra. What if it was 40 degrees for 4 days in Canberra? And this is not this is not a fanciful idea. Like this is what is being predicted. And at the same time, you've got, the Australian government, lots of our state governments continuing to approve new coal and gas expansions or new coal and gas projects. And it's so clear to us that every single fraction of a degree matters, in terms of like how many hot days, in terms of how many people die, in terms of how we live our lives. And so, whilst we have like these disasters happening, there's a real failure of like political and policy response. Like we say, like the heat is not normal or okay. The crisis is the failure to respond. And I think that this is one of the I think really things to know about heat health impacts is that like heat risk is driven by structural inequality. So it's whether you have the resources to keep cool. Like there is some health elements, things like that, but it's about like, can you afford not to go to work? Can you afford to live in a cool home? Can you afford to like turn on the aircon and not have to worry about the next bill? All of those things have a huge impact. And so when we're talking about addressing heat risks, like it's a climate policy, it's a health policy, sure, like we need to have a really good health system, but we need to be addressing the problems like upstream, not downstream. If we continue to have unsafe housing, if we continue not to, protect workers in the heat, then you're going to see more and more people calling ambulances, ending up in hospital, not being able to go to work, things like that. So we've got, some big buckets of things we're advocating for, and all of our solutions that we talk about from a big level to a very specific level are driven by what we hear from the community. Like Sweltering Cities is not a policy organization, like we are the community voice. And what that means is we are doing these big, like, and I can talk a little bit about later, like big summer surveys, lots of events, lots of listening to people, eager to listen to people here today as well, hear from them about what people want to see. One of the top things is safe homes. So that means, building safer homes for the future, including using future climate data instead of historical climate data to set out energy efficiency standards. It means safe homes for renters. It means retrofitting budgets to make sure that we're not just installing solar and batteries, even though they're good, but we're actually making our homes more efficient and thermally safe. Because functionally, like aircon doesn't work that well above about 42 degrees, or it doesn't, it's less effective. And so it's more effective for us to have cooler suburbs, cooler streets, cooler homes than it is to rely on aircon into the future. So the first big bucket, safer homes. The second bucket, cooler suburbs. Trees, blue infrastructure, great public transport, accessible streets, local amenity, making sure that people can be connected to their community, can get around in the heat. All of these things are really important. The third big category is making sure no one's left behind. So, if we know, and we do, that 89% of people who die during heat waves are people with disabilities, and I can tell you we've heard from hundreds of people who tell us that the impacts are sort of as diverse as the number of people are. Like, it's everyone who says their mobility is a huge issue for them. If you've got a guide dog, you can't take them out over a certain temperature, which really affects accessibility. People with neurological conditions who are saying, like, when it gets hot, I'm in a lot of pain, but I can't deal with bright lights, so I can't go to a library or a shopping center. So I put on an eye mask. My partner drives me around for the whole day, just to be in the cool. Again, like this feels like the best option for people. There's all sorts of different ways. And if we know that's true, like from our work, but also from statistically, then like what additional support can we give people with disabilities to make sure that they survive heat waves? What needs to be in the NDIS? How can we protect people? What additional services? Let's make people, if people who need aircon, let's make sure they can get it through the NDIS, which not everyone can, things like that. Um, and then so there's lots of ways to do that. I can get into it. But and also having I like cool safe spaces is also part of that, like heat shelters and this is me getting a bit nerdy for a sec, but heat shelters are like simultaneously something that we need because people aren't safe at home, but also a terrible long-term solution. Because like actually, like there's one in 10 Australians live in Western Sydney. Like we cannot build enough heat shelters for the 2.5 million people that live in Western Sydney who might need it. Like it is far better, and most people will want to stay at home if their home is safe. So, again, that's the upstream effects instead of the downstream effects. But we also need to make sure people have a safe space to go. So, like libraries, community centres, places where people already seek connection, these should be safe in the heat. And the last bucket of things I think is really important is sort of justice and community participation. So, like, too often we hear from people who say, like, I feel like we're the last people to be asked about changes in our community. Like, we're the last people to be told this isn't just about heat, it's about lots of other issues. And I think that, we hear from so many people who say, like, I want to be really involved in shaping the future of my community, but it's hard for me to, be optimistic about that when all I do is endless consultations and then it doesn't seem to come to practice, things like that. So, I think there is a like responsibility we collectively have to make sure that communities have a really strong, powerful voice in describing what heat resilience means to them. Like this can't be a top-down process. It has to be something where we deeply trust that people will know what they want their local community to look like into the future and the supports they need. So those are lots of different buckets, and I think a specific example of where this comes up is that we are campaigning for better bus shelters in Western Sydney. And then people have reached out to us from around the country, around the world even, saying like, yeah, bus shelters are a huge issue. Standing in the sun is really hot. So that's our broad thing, but also I guess an example of like where our community listening then results in like a really specific campaign solution, where we are collectivizing the issue and then like helping people advocate, fight for it together, taking it to the transport minister, saying like this should not be the problem of people who are trapped inside their homes because there is no bus shelter on hot days. This is the problem of the government because we need a transport system that is accessible into the future with the extreme heat we're going to experience. So yeah, that's some of the community solutions.
It's a good point. In the Canberra context, we have, for example, the light rail and
Yeah.
the extension of that. But there's that issue of the connection between someone's house and the potentially I don't know, a few kilometres to get there, and then what they do while they're there. Doesn't matter if the light rail, and I'm a big fan of light rail, but if the light rail is operating and it's a beautiful, smooth, fast, cool, air-conditioned experience, may still fail if people are getting heat exhaustion on the way
Mm.
there, which feeds into a whole range of other infrastructure issues. But Dot asked a good question about how we get community members to actively plant trees on their properties, assuming they have space and are allowed to if they're renters. In quoting, in my experience and what we've seen recently, there are a growing number of people who say no to having council and government planted trees on their verges. We were actually discussing this point before we went live.
We were, yeah. I think there's probably frustratingly, I'm sure there is no silver bullet on this. There is a few things, right? Like one of the things is having protections for existing trees. So sometimes when you get new developments, it's easier because of the planning conditions for developments to go through, or it's seen as cheaper to just level the block. Sort of what people call it moonscaping the block and then building on top. And like you can lose some like really established, beautiful trees through that process. So I think there's like parts of the planning code about saying like, preserve existing trees, make sure that like, there's been proposals to say in different parts of the country that like every dwelling should have space for a medium to large size tree in the backyard and the front yard. And so, it's those sort of like this planning controls things for like future-proofing this, instead of trying to fit small trees into inadequate spaces in the future. In terms of what we can do now, I think there's a mix of education for people about, having more trees in the street will cool your street like, multiple degrees in the summer, like having big trees. It increases the value of the properties on the street. That's been demonstrated by like studies across the country, like, potentially tens of thousands of dollars to live on a leafy street as opposed to like a really bare, hot street. So I think there's an education aspect for community members to say, like, here are the advantages. There should be, I think support from council also on like maintaining, from the government, on maintaining trees as well. I think that's a frustration people have that you get trees that are planted, you get a hot summer, the trees die, the time it takes to replace them is frustrating. Uh, and I think finally there is a problem, I think, for renters, and this is something we hear around the country, that they might like to have more planting. They might like to do that. They might like to have more trees, but they feel like, they don't have security of tenure. So what's the point in investing that? Their landlord might say no. We've heard that from people. Or there is a sense, yeah, of not having the right to do that in their properties. And so if you have, I think if we can ensure that like everyone who wants to have a tree can have a tree, I think if we do education of community members, I think if there's sufficient support for the existing trees, and I think if the planning system protects them, I think that all of those things will go a bit of a way to maintain trees. And I think, just give away heaps of trees. We were talking before we started about tree giveaways and how popular they are. So, yeah, unfortunately, no silver bullet on that, but I think unfortunately it's all of the above.
From what we've touched on, it seems that there's often um, there's the kind of hard-edged legislative lens you could take to it. I suppose the issues of around um, uh, planning codes, building codes, construction rules, all those sorts of things, which I'd like to come back to in a minute. But what about the that? I'd like to explore a little bit more that cultural side of it. How much how much should we be thinking about changing cultural attitudes, and how much do your campaigns, for example, point towards the public and the community, and changing attitudes on that versus um, campaigns that are more focused on the government and trying to get them to, it's not an either or, of course, it's a both.
Yeah. I'd say we talk about the benefits of greener cities a lot. Um, but I wouldn't say that we don't have really any education plans because I think the people who are most likely to be attached to sweltering cities or come across us see heat already as an issue. So that within our networks um, isn't as big an issue. But like a few months ago, we did or like middle of last year, we did a heat wave scenario workshop in Townsville,
Mm.
and had about 40 people in the room, and we've done a few of these workshops, keen to run more of them. Essentially, we look at what 10 years in the future, here's how hot it's going to be, here's different ways that the future might roll out in terms of like social, financial, cultural infrastructure, all these sort of things, and ask people to think about what they want to change, what we want to do. And it's these really fantastic imaginative but also practical exercises we do with people. We did a whole day. And we had some guys there from Energy Queensland who'd come via the Electrical Trade Union. And they turned up in the morning and they were like, so saying to the side, we had the North Queensland Conservation Council there with other people, and they were like, we don't normally mix with these guys, right? We don't really normally mix with um the Energy Queensland, like their jobs are to chop down bits of trees, like the tree loppers. And so there was a bit of like, what's going on in the morning? And, I was just so pleased they were there, these young guys, who, you know, they had said like, oh, we're really later in the day, like, oh, we're really worried about being here because we thought we are going to get told off. And I was like, it's fantastic to have people here who are, you know, living daily, like that experience of going up and cutting down trees. They know exactly why it's happening. But these people also really care about trees. They live in this area. They're community members. They can
Mm.
see how hot it is. They care. And so, like, basically, they came and said, like, at the end of the day, everyone was sort of agreed. It's like, it's got to be right tree, right place.
Yeah.
Like, if we keep on planting, like, the trees that will end up in the electricity wires and the electricity company has to chop them down, if we plant, like, too many, like, palm trees and things like that in different places, these won't be the most effective. So it's like, right tree, right place. And I think that there are more allies in that than we think, as long as we are talking about, you know, listening to people, treating them as partners, treating them as equals. And, by the end of the day, these guys are like volunteering to work with community members on like community garden workshops and things like that. And I think the most important thing was to say, like, just because, they have this really dangerous job. Like they were talking about having big rubber gloves that they use to do the electricity stuff, getting off the ladder, turning the gloves upside down, and literally like streams of sweat pouring out. About starting work at 3 a.m. in the future in order to do this. And like that competing thing of like, oh, we want to keep the electricity on, but we also want to have trees. And, you know, for us, it was like cultural differences can be resolved through conversation. Not all the
Yeah.
time, but I think we've got to try. So I think it's creating those opportunities to bring new people in, is one of the most effective things we can do, and treating them like they are, like their opinions are valid. We just have to sort of talk through them.
Yeah. I feel there's also uh, a certain constituency out there who, um, where to the extent there's a problem, it's air conditioning is the solution. I have a house and it's air conditioned, and I have a car and it's air conditioned, and I go to the shops or the or work and it's air conditioned, and anything that impacts my ability to get in my car and drive conveniently to other air conditioned locations is a barrier, not an opportunity. So I think there's a danger that cohort will always push back against some of the very solutions that are needed to to tackle the problem. I just noted, Peter, thanks for posting the organisation called MIR, Restoring Earth's Energy Balance, looking at some of the work cooling cities in Africa. That would be an interesting one for me to look at. Without wanting to circle back too much onto the nature of the problem, but with climate change, uh, uh, we're going to see obviously the raw temperatures getting higher, but is the urban heat island effect likely to increase in a sort of a similar linear fashion, or because relationships often don't work in a linear fashion, we might see a compounding sort of heat such that increases in the wider temperatures might result in significantly hotter uh,
Hmm.
urban effects. Have you looked at that?
I'd say not specifically. I think the building of urban heat islands is a choice. Like, and there's things like parts of cities by their nature will always be hotter, like because of the way we build than surrounding rural areas. But there is like, you know, there are ways to have like more greenery, lighter colors, things like that. This is about saying like, as I said before, like, are we planning for the like right now, if you are building a new house under the National Construction Code, it uses historical climate data based on like 1990 to 2015. It is not using future climate data, so it's underestimating how much cooling you'll need in the future, which means the energy efficiency rating you're being told is not going to be correct in 10 years from now. Or even right now, actually, to be honest, because we've had some of the hottest years on record. And I think this really doesn't pass the pub test, right? Like you could go to
Yeah.
almost anywhere, like in Canberra, and ask someone who's about to build a house, regardless of their political leanings, and say, like, do you think that you should be paying for your house to be built to a historical standard or a future standard? Like, and most people will say, like, well, I'm going to live in my house in the future. So I think all of these things are choices as part of
Yeah.
our planning system and so on. Whether like urban heat islands will get much worse as the temperatures rise, I um like already, it was 43 degrees the other day in Melbourne, and I went and on the surface, like at a tram stop, measured almost 70 degrees. And so what that means is you might be looking at your phone and saying, oh, it's really hot, but physically where you are is much hotter. I think it's having that like more granular local understanding, both for like understanding the risks and also saying like, well, like, why doesn't my local tram stop have a shade? Like if it's getting to 70 degrees on the ground on multiple days in summer. Um, yeah, I'd say that.
I mentioned before the kind of the legislation and the codes and so forth. What's your sense of how well we're doing? It's hard to generalize across the whole country, but how well are we doing in updating these building codes and these and the urban planning systems and requirements so that we're picking up best practice and future proofing, building for the future, as you said.
I would say we are not doing consistently well. And one of the biggest risks in this area is that the sort of productivity commission mindset of like, well, we need to reduce standards to make things more affordable is
Mm,
actually about maintaining a like proportion of profit for developers more than it is about thinking about what does affordable living, what does healthy living, what does like a safe housing standard look like for the people who are actually going to live in the houses. So like when you've got like more corporate interests say like, well, we need to pause any updates in like increasing energy efficiency standards for housing. And as I said, when they're already out of date, I think that is like you know, that more conservative and profit-driven, like corporate, like argument that you're hearing is like extremely destructive to making heat-safe cities in the future, or houses, or businesses, or anything like that. And so I think, unfortunately, we are not necessarily moving forward. I think there's heaps of, I think, especially the more local your level of government, the better it is. The
mm.
less it, like the more detached at the level of government we're talking about, the worse it is. And so I think that's and there is some variation, but that's really um it's about I think who feels responsibility. So like what we talk about is like what we need to do is mainstream the issues of like climate adaptation and climate mitigation across all these different departments. So it means like when you're doing transport planning, when you're doing like urban planning, things like that, you've got to be considering like how safe, like how can we make sure people can survive and thrive in this location into the future? That should be true in our justice system, it should be true in our employment system, it should be true in our schools and everywhere else. And instead, like what you get in lots of places is still adaptation mitigation is the responsibility of the climate change department or energy or in heat health sometimes as well, our ambulance services. And so it's that like it needs to be a whole of government priority. And I think that is how you will get better planning is if there is a mandate for the planning codes to be adaptive and resilient. And if they're adaptive and resilient, then you have a more adaptive and resilient community who can then participate in, social activities, work, all these, like, there's just like, there's a lot of benefits, a lot of co-benefits to all of this, basically.
Yeah, there's a New York Times bestseller that many of you in the audience will have heard of the abundance of with Ezra Klein. And one of the things that really worried me in that was that real sort of sense that we just need to get rid of all this bureaucracy and get stuff done. But and you were alluding to this before, but the danger with stripping all that away is that you enable a whole lot of profit and then transfer all the downstream costs in terms of health impacts and so forth onto public um, demands demands on the public purse. It's a potentially a very whilst the book makes some good points, it's potentially very pernicious in its effects. Are you seeing any of that coming through in the public um, debate? Kind of, especially driven by the housing shortages, which I think risks a real perverse incentives to just knock up cheap housing.
Think like our one of our biggest projects this summer, which we do every 2 years, is the National Summer Survey. And so this we asked like literally it is the biggest survey on heat, health, and homes in the country. We asked thousands of people. I think we're just above 1,500 people right now. It's going to be open for another month. And we're asking people like, yeah, how do you feel the heat? What are the impacts? What do you want done about it? And by far the majority of people say we should be planning our cities and building our housing to be safe in the future. I think that again, like yes, there is an intersection of like people like need to live in housing that they can afford. Um, but what we need to do is not make safe housing like I think people we consistently hear like they do not think that like safe, sustainable housing should be a luxury good. And if we don't increase the floor of the standards, then that's what it becomes. Like the average house energy efficiency rating in Victoria, and I think this is probably true for most of the country, is under 2 stars. So if like, 0 stars is like living in a tent, and 10 stars is you don't need to use any, cooling or heating to have a good, comfortable temperature. And the current star rating is 7, minimum of 7. Most people are closer to a tenth than they are to the current standard. And so I think that unless we really do a major project of lifting up that floor, and that's exactly what people support, we're going to see again inequality is what will kill people in housing. And I would say that I think we had an early target of getting 50 people on the ACT to do the summer survey, and people just smashed through it, and we're up to 70 at the moment. But we'd love to be getting to over 100 or even more. So I'm happy to put the link in the chat. But if, we'd love to hear what every single person here, how they're feeling the heat, but also we would really ask if you could share it with other people. Next week is Extreme Heat Awareness Day. It's really hot at the moment. So this week is a perfect week to be saying like, can you do this survey? I've like whether you want them to talk about housing, whether they've got a great story about their health, whatever it is to share it around. Because as I said at the beginning, like the campaigns we do and the policy solutions we advocate for come from community voices. And so the more people we get in the ACT, the more authority we're going to be able to have to come back to you and others and say, well, we had all these people say like this is the number one solution they'd like to see. And that credible evidence helps us build the transformative solutions instead of that individual response. So I'll put the link in the chat.
Yeah, we'll in case any of you miss it, we'll also send it out to all of you afterwards. Um, so what's the organisation doing to mark Extreme Heat Day?
Yes. So yeah, we invented Extreme Heat Awareness Day last year alongside Australian Red Cross because it turns out you can just declare a day. If you, yeah, it turns out you can just do it. Especially if you do it with the Red Cross. And this is because there is an International Extreme Heat Awareness Day or an International Heat Action Day, but it's in June,
Yeah,
in the Northern Hemisphere summer. So we said that's not just fundamentally not going to work for us. It's always hot in February. So next week, the first Wednesday in February, February 4th, is Extreme Heat Awareness Day. We have got a webinar during the day for anyone to join from across the country. We've got people from the Nurses Union, academic experts, the leader of homelessness manager at City of Sydney, they've had a cool hub that they've been setting up to support people. It's an incredible program. We've got great speakers. That's happening next Wednesday. People can sign up. You can either run your own event, like we had people last year who did heat quizzes with their colleagues over lunch, all the way to, if you wanted to run a stall or integrate it into an existing event, that's great. We can send around a link. We've got social media assets. Things people can share, follow us on social media, but really just using that opportunity to say, like, do the people in my life have a heatwave plan? Do I have a heatwave plan? What is my, government, like, what is the government doing, both like the territory government, but also, the federal government, and just really sincerely saying, like, this heat should not be your problem to face alone. It shouldn't be the problem of, the mum down the road who lives in a really hot house who is anxious day after day about her kids and their sleep and worry about how she's going to pay bills. It should not be her who is facing it alone. It should not be you who is facing it alone. The awareness has to be that there should be, these transformative, urgent solutions that are about making our cities more livable, more sustainable, more equitable, and safer, basically. So we can share some links around for that as well.
yes, you're getting a lot of
Yeah,
thumbs
I
up for
think
that.
that
So
one hit a nerve. Yeah. So
yeah,
yeah.
I'll be signing up to that webinar myself next week. That sounds really interesting
Mm.
because as you said, these are not. It's not just a climate issue; it's a social issue, an equity issue, a transport infrastructure construction issue. And as long as these things just keep being seen in a climate department silo, we're not going to make uh, much progress there at all. As an aside, as I think I may have mentioned to you, as a someone who also volunteers in the emergency services, the a particular concern of mine would be uh, that combination of events where, for example, a heat wave causes a fire which knocks out the power system, which knocks out air conditioning. And if we have built a city that depends for our survival on how well air conditioned we are, you could have a sudden heat emergency emerging out of another emergency, and that could get very ugly indeed. And as always, the people who suffer most are the renters, um, the older the people, the sicker, and so forth. Um, Thanks for all your for those in the audience, thanks for all the fantastic comments and bits of information and links and things that have been coming through. I've been uh, enjoying reading them. Um, we're coming up on the end of our time this morning, so thank you to all of you in the audience. It's been a great turnout for this one. I hope you found it interesting. Most of all, of course, Emma, thank you so much for joining us today and sparing an hour to talk us through the issues of sweltering cities.
My pleasure. It was always great to talk to the people of the ACT.
And I hope to see all of you for our next webinars. Excuse me, we have a couple in the pipeline. One will be looking at the ACT's draft nature conservation strategy, which is due out soon, and also the ACT climate strategy discussion paper. So keep an eye out for details of those in the Conservation Council's Yellow Box newsletter. So on that point, let's wrap it up. Enjoy the day, everyone. Stay cool and see you for the next one.